Phillip Ettinger was born on February 10th, 1931. He served as a corporal in the Army Medical Corps during the Korean War. This interview was recorded in Davis, California on November 10th, 2014. The interviewers involved are Lana Mogler and Brett Furtek. The interview is being conducted for the Veterans History Project at the Library of Congress.
Philip, just for the record, when and where were you born?
Monticello, New York, February 10th, 1931.
And what were your parents' occupancies, and about how many siblings, and what were their gender?
I had one brother who was 6 years older than I am. My father died when I was 6 years old, and I was raised by my mother.
What were you doing before you were drafted or enrolled?
Student.
How did you get into the medical field?
Through the Army. I had a choice of schools when I was drafted after basic training, and the two schools that were offered to me were machine gunner or x-ray school. I chose x-ray.
Did you have any other family members that served in the Army that led you to serve?
No, my brother served in the Navy during World War II.
As a veteran, were you drafted or did you enlist?
Drafted. 1952.
How did you feel about being drafted, and what was your family's reaction to you being drafted?
I had no qualms whatsoever. I was still idealistic about serving the country. My mother was a single mother at the time, and she knew it had to be, so there was never any question.
Did you work at a field hospital or serve from within the U.S.?
Within the U.S.
And where did you say you served?
Fort Belvoir, Virginia. It was a military hospital.
What kind of work were you doing in the hospital?
I worked with in the X-ray department.
What were the first days like when you got to Virginia, and did you have any training, like early, what were your early days of training like, and what was training camp like?
Well, basic training was at Camp Pickett, Virginia, and that was 8 weeks. And then we were sent to Fort Brooke General Hospital in San Antonio, Texas, for my X-ray training. And we had to go from Virginia by train to Atlanta, and then to San Antonio, Texas by train.
A lot of traveling. What were you doing in you said you had some training before your X-ray training. What was that initial training? What kind of things did you have to do?
We were trained for 8 weeks, basic training. Every soldier is originally an infantryman, and then you get additional training after the first 8 weeks. So the first 8 weeks is basic infantry training. The second 8 weeks it was Army Medical Corps as a medic.
Right. Since you stayed in the U.S., did you have any, were you trained in combat medicine at all, or was it?
Absolutely, combat medicine. Army medic.
Right.
You have to be trained as
right.
combat medic.
Yeah. What was your initial reaction to being immersed in the military life?
Well, it was very unique. Originally, the first day, we were sent to Fort Jackson, South Carolina. Arrived there in the middle of the night, and told, it was about 200 of us. They brought us to a tent city and said, "Find an empty bunk." And so we had to walk between tent to tent with our duffel bags to find someplace to sleep. So I found an empty bunk in a tent had about 18 beds in it, with a potbelly stove in the middle, and was scared
Yeah, I
because
can imagine.
I had about 4 hours to sleep before they woke you up. So it was an interesting story, though, because when I didn't know what to do when I had, so I figured I'd be smart. I took my wallet and put it in the pillowcase and then crawled into the bunk and put my duffel bag under the bed, under the bunk. In the morning when I woke up, the wallet was gone.
Oh, wow.
It was interesting, though, because here's what happened. When I woke up in the morning, when they woke us up, I saw of the 18 beds, I was the only white soldier in that tent. So what was I going to do? My wallet was missing. So I went to breakfast with everybody else. When I came back, all these soldiers, they were all black, around the potbelly stove, and one of them said to me, "Soldier, you missing something?" I said, "Yes." He flipped me my wallet. And he said to me, "Aren't you going to count it? What's in there?" I said, "No." And I put it in my pocket and went about my business. I developed probably 17 friends that day.
Wow.
It was an amazing experience. There was this scared white Jewish kid from Miami, and faced with that the very first day.
Yeah, going off of that, so since the Korean War was the first war where they had racial integration, so you were just telling a story about that. Do you know, or what did you know about the racial integration, and did you have any other experiences with that besides the one you were just describing how how you were the only white soldier in your camp or in your group? Did you have any other experiences relating to the racial integration in the...
None whatsoever. Remember, this was Fort Jackson, South Carolina, 1952. That's 62 years ago. It's a lot different in Fort Jackson today, I'm sure, than it was then. But as a white boy meeting 17 black soldiers on his first day in the military, it was a shock. But that little episode changed it completely for me.
To loop back to your training, what was involved really with X-ray training specifically comparatively to field training, and what was that training like as well?
Well, that's another interesting story, because when we left Camp Pickett, where we were trained as an Army medic, we were being sent to San Antonio, Texas. Well, there was 20 of us going there. And for some reason, the sergeant thought I looked intelligent. So he said, "Ettinger, you're in charge of these 20 men. Here are their travel orders. Take them to San Antonio." So gave me tickets for the train. And from Camp Pickett, we all took a bus to Norfolk, Virginia, the rail station. That's the first time I'm in charge of anything like this. So in Norfolk, the passenger terminal is an upper level, and the trains travel underneath the terminal. So as we were marching in with everybody with their packs and the duffel bags, I asked this red cap, "Where's the train to Atlanta?" So he looks down, he says, "There it is, soldier, it's getting ready to leave." Okay, I said, "Follow me, men." So we all run down the stairs, and the train is starting to move, and we're throwing our duffel bags up, and the conductor is catching them and pulls us all in, and we all get on the train. He says, "Let me see your orders." Okay, so I give him my orders. He says, "Soldier, you're on the wrong train." So they had to stop at the next stop, get a bus, take us back to Norfolk, and then we had to wait about 8 hours till the next train to Atlanta. But eventually we made it to San Antonio. But that was my first experience in charge of a group of men.
And so would you say that X-ray training would be different comparatively to the other medicines, and how would the training for that be different? Would it be more...
Well, Brooke General Hospital is a major installation in the medical corps. And the training there was very intense. It was 8 weeks of intense training, and we had a lot of foreign students that were training there. And interesting thing though, when in X-ray, when they did the couple hours on atomic energy, the foreign students were not allowed to sit in the class. We had students from the islands, some from Britain, but they wouldn't allow them to sit in the class when they gave us the lecture and demonstration on atomic energy. But it was 16 weeks of X-ray training, of which some of it was conducted in Brooke General Hospital. And Brooke General Hospital received a lot of the casualties from Korea. So we got to see some very intense injuries.
We read some information that said that there were less hospitals in the Korean War than were usually open during the wars or created for the war. Would you say that your hospitals were especially full in terms of people per bed?
Were the hospitals full? Absolutely, they were full. People think a wounded soldier is just a little wound, it's a little nick or a bullet wound. It's major. Traumatic bullet wounds are major, are very horrific.
So you said that you served all over the United States. From what years did you serve? From when to when?
February 1952 to February 1954, 2 years.
How do you say the U.S. soldiers got along with the Korean soldiers? Would you say that their relations were good, or were they a little bit?
My experience in Korea was less than 1 day. I'll tell you why. As an Army medic, I was sent over to Korea on a plane with 200 to 300 other men. And when I got there, somebody said, we're looking for an Army medic. Well, I was told a long time ago never to volunteer, so I stuck my hand up. I'm an Army medic. And they needed an Army medic to escort an injured congressman's son back to the United States. So I landed in Korea, and I left Korea on the same day. And then when I got back, they sent me down to headquarters outside of Washington, I forget where, and they had to assign me someplace. So and at that point, I was just an Army medic. So they had said they had 2 schools available. They had a machine gunner school or an X-ray school. X-ray. I raised my hand. I'll go take the X-ray because I knew there wasn't many jobs in civilian life for machine gunners. So since I just got out of high school, really, I didn't have much experience. So I went to X-ray school.
Even though you weren't in Korea, would you say that there was a noticeable shift when the Chinese actually entered the war?
A noticeable shift? Extremely so, because we lost a lot of men in that reservoir battle.
So you said you operated primarily on the East Coast. Would you say that the majority of soldiers were flown to the East Coast when they were injured, or would they stay mostly on the West Coast?
No, they were brought to some central stations. One was at Letterman Hospital in California, Brooke General Hospital in San Antonio, and Walter Reed in Washington.
Did you make any really long-term friends while you were serving, and are you still in touch with them?
I did make some long-term friends, but unfortunately, part of the training, in X-ray training, was we used to X-ray each other. Now, in 1952, it was not commonly recognized the danger of such a treatment, not such a course of training. And I happened to be exceptionally good in the dark room. For some reason, I got assigned to the dark room, and I was developing everybody else's X-rays. Well, all of my classmates were X-raying each other. And about 15 years later, I got a call from the War Department wanting to know about my general health. So, of course, I told them, and I asked them why. And it seems that many of my fellow classmates who were spending 4 months X-raying each other were developing cancers. And a few that I knew personally, I called, and sure enough, they had cancers because over X-rayed. So we were not X-raying dummies or mannequins; they were X-raying each other. And fortunately, I spent most of that time, other than the classroom, instead of doing practical X-rays on each other, I was in the darkroom developing everybody else's X-rays. So I was not subjected to the radiation that my fellow classmates were, who many of them did not survive that.
Going back, you mentioned the reservoir battle. What is that, and why were so many men lost?
Because the Chinese entered it and came across the chosen reservoir en masse and surprised the U.S. Army.
What was the X-ray technology like back then, and how do you think it would be different? How do you think the technical differences between now and then?
Night and day. Everything now is electronic, digital. I stayed in the X-ray field my entire career, thankfully, because of what I learned in the Army. And I worked in an orthopedic office with a captain that I met in the Army. He hired me. We both got discharged at the same time, and I worked for 8 years for him. And then I went into my own business, my own X-ray business, developed a portable service, which was quite interesting because we wound up in 14 different cities and 8 different states doing portable X-rays. Now, an X-ray, it cost me at that time $35,000 to equip and buy an X-ray, portable X-ray unit. That means the truck, the equipment, and the X-ray machine. That same unit today costs over $200,000 because everything is digitized.
Did you have to deal with a lot of POWs in your line of work?
None.
None?
No.
Okay. Would you say that it was easy for most soldiers to stay in contact with their families while in war or at war? And how would they do so?
That was never an issue. It was never a problem. The mail was a priority. I remember when I was in basic training, my wife, we were told to have them send 1 letter a week. My wife sent a letter every day. Used to drive the sergeant nuts when mail call. Ettinger, Ettinger, Ettinger. Everybody else got 1 letter. I got 7 or 8. So that was never an issue.
So, where were you when the war ended, and like who was with you? What was it all like?
Well, it wasn't the grand celebration that you received at the end of World War II, World War I imagine, because I was already, the war was winding down and I was already discharged. I think the war ended in '56, I'm not sure, somewhere around there.
Yeah, I think it was 1953, but so how did you return home, and what was it like coming home?
Well, remember, I had a single mother, and for some reason, I don't think she thought I was going to survive because she got rid of all my clothes. I came home, I had no clothes. She gave everything away. So I returned to Miami, Florida, and went to school nights. But remember, I got a job, came home to a job through this Army captain that I met at Fort Belvoir. And he had an orthopedic office in Miami Beach. He offered me a job since we were both being discharged about the same time. So I went to work for him and went to the University of Miami nights.
Do you remember any specific patients throughout your time in practice, and what and who and what was the story with that?
Now you're pushing me. That's 60 years ago. I don't even remember the name of the congressman's son that I escorted back to his country. No, I really can't answer that.
What were some of the more common injuries that you saw?
Loss of limbs. I remember the most interesting one we saw at Brooke General Hospital was a soldier with an open abdominal wound. They sent him back from Korea with his intestines outside his abdomen, and we were trying to determine which section of the small bowel was still intact. So we were actually doing a GI series with catheters through the open wound on his abdomen. And that was the most fascinating one I have ever seen. Because usually you do a GI series, you swallow some barium, and barium goes through your intestines and you x-ray it. Here we had the intestines on top of the patient, and we're trying to determine which part of the intestines was viable.
So how would you say these war experiences working with these patients that were coming from South Korea, how do you think that has affected you as a person or just in your life?
Well, I've always resented the fact when people refer to war injuries, they say we only had 20 wounded, like only 20 wounded.
Right.
20 wounded on a battlefield is not little nicks and cuts and bruises. These are major, major injuries when you do high velocity wounds.
Would you say that the soldiers that you saw would ever go back into war, or were the injuries serious enough where they were?
The ones that came to Brooke General Hospital were too severe.
So near or partway through the Korean War, Eisenhower was elected, and that was a pretty big deal from what we learned in our research. What was your reaction to that, or the other soldiers around you? How did they react to Eisenhower being elected?
They didn't, there was no comment. Remember, we were enlisted personnel. We had very little political information available to us. We did what we were told,
Right.
and didn't question.
Is there a specific reason that the injuries that you saw were treated in the U.S. compared to operating in Korea?
The ones that operated on in Korea were to sustain the patient, the injured soldier, until they could get back to the States for better care. I mean, a field hospital in the military can do a certain amount of repair and emergency type work, but when you're talking about convalescing, long-term convalescing, and loss of limb. They really could do just basic. These were field hospitals. These were not major trauma centers. And they were able to get the injured soldiers back fast enough. At that time, what was considered fast enough, within 24 hours,
Okay.
they could get them back. Today, it would be within 6 hours.
So, what was the difference in the treatment of the enlisted versus the draftees?
Well, I think it was very noticeable that the officer corps, which were all regular Army, would look at your serial number and tell if it's an RA in the front or US. US meaning draftee, RA meaning regular Army. And I think it was indicative of the type of assignments you got. I was fortunate because my situation where they were looking for some place to place me, I wasn't competing with the regular Army. They had to find a place for me, and as I said before, it was either machine gunner school or X-ray school. So that was the only class distinction, but it was there.
So in the X-ray school, would you say most of the people were draftees or enlisted, or do you know?
Combination of both.
Okay.
When you found out you wouldn't actually be going to Korea, how did you feel, and did other soldiers treat you differently because you weren't in Korea?
No, not at all, because we were all very happy we were not going to Korea. Korea was not a resort.
How did soldiers that came back from Korea treat you? Was it any differently than if you had served as a field medic?
No, remember the people that came back from Korea that came in contact with me were all war wounded. They were casualties. So it was never an issue there.
They're very happy to see you.
Yes.
So while you were working in the medical hospital, were there noticeable times when there would be big waves of patients coming in? And do you know what big battles were going on?
No,
those
not
waves?
really, because remember, Fort Belvoir was not a major trauma center.
Oh, right.
Those were Letterman, Brooke General, Walter Reed. We got a lot of the injured from Fort Belvoir, Fort Myers, and the regional.
So it was kind of more of a
Yeah.
steady.
Yeah, we were not getting a lot of the war wounded once I got to Fort Belvoir. That was only when I was in training at Brooke General.
Did you volunteer for any positions in your time in the military?
Absolutely. Whatever I could volunteer for. I was told before I went in, don't volunteer for anything. It's wrong. The first week in basic training, there were 200 of us out there. Sergeant says, "Can anybody in here type?" I raised my hand. I can type. I took typing class in high school. I spent the next 12 weeks in the major's office typing his reports and everything. Everybody else was out in the field doing maneuvers and getting filthy dirty, and I was in the office typing. So I didn't listen to the advice I got, fortunately.
So you think it helped you kind of, I don't know, do better or in the Army that since you were volunteering, do you think it helped you in your career as an X-ray technician or as a medical personnel that you volunteered a lot? Like what kind of other opportunities did you get from that?
From X-ray?
Or sorry, from volunteering. Were
Well-
there any other experiences, like really significant ones, that you think have brought you to where you are today?
No, not really. I think the two that I mentioned, the one typing in the major's office, and the one in Korea when I was arriving there and they needed a medic to escort an injured congressman's son home. That was the only two times I really volunteered. And
Served very well.
served me
Yeah.
very well.
It's like a life lesson. Were there any other life lessons you learned during your military service?
Well, I think one that stands out that I always remembered for some reason was the tremendous amount of waste in the military. We had 200 men in our company, and I remember the first holiday, I think it was Easter, I forget which holiday it was. I lived in Florida. It was too far away from Camp Pickett, Virginia to go home for the holiday, so there was about 15 of us in the company, and everyone else went home for the holiday. And I go into the mess for breakfast, and I see all these piles of food, turkeys. Must have been a dozen turkeys waiting to be cooked. And I said, "There's only 12 of us here. Why do you?" I said to the mess sergeant, "Why do you have so many turkeys?" He says, "If we don't order enough turkey for 200 men, then if we only order enough turkey for 12 men, next holiday we'll only get food for 12 men." So they sent food for 200 men. So I said, "What are you going to do with all those turkeys?" He said, "I'm going to sell them to a restaurant in town, cook them and sell them." That was first experience with waste in the military.
What would you say you would have? What would you think you would have done if you had stayed in Korea?
I was only there one day, remember. I never got to stay.
Would you say that you might have been a field medic? Were most medics that were sent there and not probably sort of?
Well, originally, you're trained as an infantryman, you're trained as a medic. I would have been a field medic. I hadn't been to X-ray school yet, so I would have been in the field hospital or in the field as a medic, where the casualty rates were very high.
Okay.
Well, thank you so much for your service to our country and for your time here today.
You're very welcome. You're a delightful group.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.